Everyone blames a curse for the vampire king's dying son, until a human nanny realizes his sickness isn't in his blood, it's under his bed. The castle itself is feeding on him each night, and if she pulls him free, she might bring the whole kingdom down. She first saw the castle of the vampire king at the end of a day that had forgotten how to be light. The road wound upward between cliffs that leaned close as if to listen. Mist clung to every hollow. Trees thinned and then vanished, leaving only scrub and stone, until the carriage emerged onto a bare ridge where the wind tasted of iron and deep, unseen water. Ahead, the castle rose from the cliff edge like a growth of black crystal, crowned by towers that stabbed into low, thick clouds. A river hammered at the rock far below, its voice lost beneath the rumble of wheels and the beating hooves. Inside the carriage, the nanny kept her hands folded in her lap to stop them from betraying any tremor. The leather satchel beside her, worn smooth over years, bumped gently with each rut in the road. Within it lay small things she understood, folded linen, salves, vials, herbs tied in waxed cloth, a book of notes in her own cramped hand. Tools for fevers and coughs, for rashes and night terrors, for the frightened breathing of children who did not understand why their bodies had become foreign. They had been enough, sometimes. Other times they had not. She had learned to live with that. This sickness, she had been told, was not like those. Rumor had gone ahead of the king's messenger. In market squares she had heard people say the vampire king's son was cursed. Others claimed the boy was paying for the sins of his ancestors, or for the king's wars, or for some bargain struck when the foundations of that black castle were laid. Each storyteller wrapped fear around ignorance like cloth around a wound, hoping it would hold. The messenger had offered no explanations, just gold, and a carriage, and the cold efficiency of a royal command. She had accepted. A child lay sick in that fortress, and no one in the villages below would go near him. That knowledge pressed against her more insistently than any fear of kings. The carriage rolled under the portcullis with a shudder she felt more than heard. Inside the walls, the air changed. Sound dulled, as if each stone was accustomed to swallowing noise. Courtyards opened and closed around them, flanked by arcades where statues with wounded faces stared from shadow. The wheels rattled over cobbles wet with something more than rain, the stones glistened as though they had been polished by many years of reluctant feet. When the carriage stopped at last, no one rushed forward. Servants stood in a neat row beneath an archway, their clothing dark and precise, their eyes lowered. The horses stamped and blew mist into the air. The driver opened the door from outside and held it without looking at her. She stepped down into a world of stone and height. Cold flowed up through the soles of her boots. The satchel strap bit familiarly into her palm. One of the servants, older than the rest, stepped forward with the stiffness of someone whose joints had started to betray them long ago. He announced himself in a low tone, named her status as the prince's new caretaker, and made a slight, formal inclination of his head that was not quite welcome and not quite warning. They led her into the castle. The corridors multiplied and twisted. Lamps burned behind glass that dulled their flame to a steady, unnatural stillness. Tapestries hung between doorways and along stairwells, bright with dyes that refused to fade, showing forests where trees had human eyes, rivers choked with fallen crowns, animals with saints' faces bound in thorns. With each turn and climb, the air thinned, not in breath but in warmth. The higher they went, the more the cold felt deliberate. The servant spoke as they climbed, not by choice but by duty. He outlined the boy's history in the same balanced tone one might use to list inventory. The prince had been fragile from infancy. Fevers, sudden collapses, a persistent pallor that did not lift even after long rests. He tired quickly. His growth lagged. Sometimes he woke with bruises in odd places when no one had laid a hand on him. The best healers had been summoned, human physicians with instruments and charts, blood mages from distant cities who read illness in bowls of crimson water, itinerant holy women who burned herbs and muttered prayers not meant for these halls. Some remedies had eased this symptom or that, for a time. None had changed the course of the illness. Fewer people spoke of the nights. On those, even less could be done. At last they reached a corridor where the air went still. The stones here were darker, the tapestries heavier, their woven scenes blurred as though someone had passed a hand over the threads until details smudged. Torches burned at longer intervals, leaving stretches of shadow between them. Only one door stood here, at the corridor's far end, massive and smooth, its surface carved with a crown, a crescent, and a pattern of thorned branches curling inward. The servant stopped and repeated a set of instructions in the same dry tone. The boys' meals. The schedule for linens. The things the new caretaker should not do: move the bed, unshutter the windows fully, permit certain old superstitions inside. Then he left her, his footsteps shrinking into the corridor's silence more quickly than they should have. She stood alone before the prince's room. Inside, the first impression was of contrast. Warmth glowed in the fireplace, the flames were high and well-fed. Candlelight pooled on polished wood, on the glass of cabinets, on the metal of a wash basin. Yet despite this, the air that met her felt as though it had been drawn up from a deep well and only half remembered how to be air. She could raise her hand and feel the heat from the fire on her skin while the inner corners of the room remained untouched by it. The bed commanded the center of the far wall. It was a massive thing of carved dark wood and heavy posts, its canopy draped in layered fabrics that drank light. The curtains hung three-quarters closed, enclosing a space at once intimate and theatrical. Between their folds she glimpsed the pale oval of a face on the pillow. She crossed the room, each step measured, fighting the urge to soften her tread. Her work required steadiness, not secrets. The boy's eyes followed her approach. They were red, like his father's, but not the clear, steady red of a predator's gaze. These were clouded, ringed with gray, as if something had been leached from them. His skin looked thin, drawn tight over fine bones. The blue-green traceries of veins showed clearly at wrists and temples. His breath came in shallow pulls, lifting his narrow chest only a little each time, as if each breath had to negotiate for passage. She rested the back of her fingers against his forehead. Warm, but not with the wild, erratic heat of infection, rather a low, persistent fever, like embers in ash that never quite died. She felt the pulse in his wrist with gentle pressure. It stuttered occasionally, slipping out of rhythm and back again. His hand lay light in hers, more weightless than it should have been, as though gravity had forgotten him. Her eyes catalogued things past habit, the faint hollows under his cheekbones, the way his nails were slightly discolored, the soft tremor in the muscles of his throat when he swallowed, the shape of old bruising fading yellow at his ribs where his nightshirt gaped. A body under siege by something that took but did not reveal itself. Her attention drifted briefly away from his face to the rest of the bed. The mattress was thick. The linens were fine, though creased, with a faint sourness that told her they had been laundered by hands that worked quickly but without much care for this room. The canopy's fabric looked newly brushed, yet there was dust on top of the posts where a feather duster could not reach. On the floor, a large rug sprawled beneath the bed, its woven pattern of vines and antlered beasts looping in on itself. As she moved around the bed to examine the boy from the other side, she felt it. Not saw, not heard. Felt. A patch of air near the floor, colder than the rest, dense in a way temperature alone could not account for. It touched her shins like water at a shoreline. Her gaze slid downward almost of its own accord. The valance hiding the gap beneath the bed was simple, trailing just enough to brush the rug. Firelight touched it and cast a shadow along the edging. Beneath that, the darkness under the bed seemed ordinary at a glance. Yet the longer she looked at that sliver of space, the more it reminded her of a pond at night that refused to reflect the moon. It was a depth, not just an absence of light. A breath behind her shoulder, near the doorway, made her straighten. A servant had entered with a tray, announced in a low murmur that this was the prince's broth, and retreated almost instantly. The tray was left on a table by the door, too far for a sick child to reach. The servant did not cross into the room's deeper half. That avoidance was a detail like any other. She pinned it in her thoughts alongside the odd cold and the quality of the boy's fever, and then turned back to the practical tasks of washing and feeding, measuring and noting. Routine, applied against unease. The first night showed her the pattern that had been described, but not truly explained. Until sundown, such as it was behind the shutters, the boy's condition remained steady, weak but predictable. He dozed, roused, accepted small amounts of broth and water. She took stock of the supplies already in the room, jars of powders, dried herbs, strips of cloth, glass vials with residue clinging to their insides like stubborn ghosts. Each had been labeled in different hands, some elegant, some cramped, some shaky. Each represented someone else who had tried. When the dim light from the shutters judged the day to be over, the room's feeling shifted. It began with a subtle thickening of the air. The fire seemed to push harder, its flames lengthening, its smoke thinning in its struggle to rise. A thread of chill crept from under the bed to wrap itself around her ankles, and stayed. The boy's breath, which had been shallow but regular, shortened further. Sometimes he paused between breaths just long enough for dread to tighten her chest in sympathy. She sat by the bed, a hand on his arm, and watched night unclench its fingers through the castle. Distant sounds, doors closing, voices dropping, footsteps thinning along the corridors, faded until the only noises were those inside the room, the pop of a log, the faint scrape of her chair, the rough silk of the boy's breathing. And, barely audible, something else. It could have been imagination. She told herself that more than once. Yet each time the castle's bells marked another hour of darkness, she heard it again, always from the same direction, beneath the bed. A soft, moist sound like something heavy turning slowly on a damp surface. Once, close to midnight, the noise took on a faint sucking rhythm, timed unsettlingly with the boy's breath. The hairs rose along her arms. In houses where superstition ruled, she had trained herself to look for mundane causes first. Rats, faulty floorboards, drafts. Here, no rat would be allowed to chew the royal furniture. Floorboards that creaked had long ago been replaced by quiet stone. Drafts there were, but this was not draft sound. Still, she did not look under the bed that night. She had just arrived. Her presence here was tolerated, not welcomed. The child needed her calm more than she needed answers that might shake it. She banked her curiosity as she would a fire, and watched the boy until pale light crept reluctantly around the shutters. By the second day, a shape had begun to form in her understanding, not yet clear enough to name. Certain things did not add up. The boy's decline followed a rhythm too precise to be random. His worst hours came not at the height of the day's fatigue, but in the deep of the night, often after midnight, when the castle was most quiet and the cold under the bed most intense. Healing drafts that ought to have invigorated barely scratched the surface. Strength gained in the morning ebbed mysteriously by dawn. On that second evening, she decided not to wait for answers to come politely. As the last servants left, as footsteps faded and the corridor outside settled into its unnatural stillness, she rearranged the room in small ways that could be explained if anyone asked. She drew her chair closer to the foot of the bed and angled it so she could see both the prince's face and the strip of floor at the edge of the rug. She set her satchel by her feet, its contents within reach, though nothing inside had been designed for what she suspected she might find. The bells marked the hours past sunset. The fire lowered itself, its flame compact but stubborn. The thin air in the room thickened with the smell of old stone and banked embers. The boy's breathing shortened gradually. Sweat gathered at his hairline despite the coolness of his skin. His fingers twitched as if grasping something in dreams. Then came the shift. It was not a gust, not a sudden slam of cold. It was more like a pressure wave rolling up from the floor, through the bed, through her bones. Shadows along the walls seemed to lean inward for a heartbeat. Her chest tightened. Under the bed, the darkness took on a density that made her feel, irrationally, yet undeniably, that if she stepped into it, her foot would not find solid planks. The sound followed, a slick, unhurried movement, somewhere between a sigh and a drag. Her throat felt dry. She rose slowly from the chair, hand steady on the bedpost, and circled to the side where the valance drooped closest to the floor. Kneeling made her joints complain in the silence. She let her breathing slow, so it would not drown out anything important. Then, with the same care she would use to check whether a child had hidden under covers, she lifted the edge of the fabric 2 fingers width. Light from the hearth traveled obediently over the rug, along the floorboards, and disappeared sharply at the bed's margin. Beyond that, there was not simple absence but a kind of opacity, like looking into deep water at night where reflections refused to form. Her eyes worked hard, trying to extract shapes. At first she saw nothing but layers of dark. Then the darkness moved. It was a slow motion, almost lazy, but deliberate. A bulge of deeper black swelled against the less deep black around it, then receded. Within that bulge, the suggestion of a curve. Length. The vaguest outline of a limb coiled on itself. It had no clear edges. Wherever she tried to fix its boundary, it blurred, smoky and uncommitted. From its upper surface, something stretched upward toward the mattress, threads of shadow finer than cobweb, glistening briefly in her peripheral vision before sinking into the bed. As one of those diffuse threads tightened, the boy exhaled a thin, strained breath. She let the curtain fall, very gently. Her heart hammered in her ears. It took effort to return to her chair at a pace that did not betray fear. She picked up a jar and opened it, not because its salve would help, but because the sound of a lid turning and glass touching wood felt like resistance against an encroaching silence. Her mind, dragged along despite terror, began to catalogue what she had seen. The thing under the bed was not an animal. It did not possess the random caution of vermin or the restless agitation of a trapped beast. Its movements had purpose. It lay not coiled randomly, but anchored in that exact spot, beneath the center of the bed, beneath the center of the boy. Its threads reached only upward. Its pulsing matched not the ticking of a clock, but the faltering rhythm of a human breath. It fed. On what, she did not entirely know. On warmth, on vitality, on those unseen measures that healers called force or humors. Whatever it consumed, it drew from the prince. What frightened her more than its existence was its placement. The bed was not a piece dragged into this spot temporarily, with something crawling under by chance. The bed had been set here with ceremony. Its posts carved with symbols. Its canopy sewn with sigils that might be decoration, or might not. The creature under it, if creature was even the right word, had the settled air of something in the right place. Someone had made this arrangement. Someone maintained it by not changing it. And everyone above whispered about curses, as if that vague word could wrap everything in inevitability. She thought of the child's dreams. The way his eyes sometimes moved under their lids as if watching something rise toward him. The mornings when he woke more tired than when he had gone to sleep. The old bruises in strange places. The slow, steady draining of his strength. A curse was not a fog. It was a decision that had once been made. The days that followed she spent in a double vigilance. Outwardly, nothing changed. She kept to the routine of a caretaker. She washed the boy and turned him so his bones would not wear through skin on one side. She coaxed broth and diluted blood into him, according to the regimen the household physician had written out in careful ink. She measured his pulse at intervals and made notes in a book of her own, pretending to be concerned only with the usual business of an illness. Inwardly, she mapped. She watched the shadows under the bed each night, though she did not always dare to look under the curtain. She watched the particular way the cold pooled in that part of the room, how far it extended, how it reacted to the fire's fluctuations. She counted the seconds between each of the boy's breaths when the pulsing under the floor grew stronger. She observed that the creature, if it could be called that, seemed to swell most during the hours between midnight and the first paling of the sky. She also listened beyond the room. Servants spoke more freely when they did not think anyone of importance was listening. In the servants' hall, over pots and chopping boards, they traded stories in mutters meant to be heard only by their own. She drifted near, always within the bounds of propriety, ears open. They said the prince's room had always been unlucky. That no nurse lasted there long. Some claimed the first caretaker had fallen down the stairs. Others said she had simply vanished, leaving her belongings neatly folded in a chest as if planning to return. There were mentions of a second and third caretaker, each staying shorter than the last, each growing thinner, paler, more haunted. The fourth, her immediate predecessor, was spoken of with an uncomfortable shrug. That one, the servants said, had become strange, muttering to herself about walls and roots and wells under the bed. One day she had been gone. No one would answer where. No one ever spoke of moving the prince to another room. In the lower parts of the castle, beneath the kitchens and storerooms, old passages honeycombed the rock. She learned of them from an offhand comment by a scullery boy who complained that certain barrels should be rolled down one staircase instead of another because it was shorter. Questions asked lightly, at the right moments, brought half answers: an old cistern here, a forgotten armory there, a collapsed chapel buried under later masonry. On a rare afternoon when the prince slept more deeply than usual and a guard outside his chamber door became distracted with a visiting captain, she slipped away with the quiet step long practice had given her. She followed the smell of damp stone and the sound of water until she found the narrow stair the boy had mentioned. It wound downward, tighter and tighter, until the air cooled in a way that had nothing to do with drafts. Moisture beaded on the walls. At the bottom she stepped into a passage just tall enough for her to stand upright, its ceiling rough, its floor uneven. No torches burned here. The small lamp she carried made a fragile bubble of yellow. Beyond it, darkness pooled like thick liquid, resistant to penetration. She walked slowly, one hand trailing along the wall. The passage turned and branched. From certain forks came air that felt wrong in her lungs, so cold it seemed to scratch. From others came faint noises, the drip of water, the creak of settling stone, something that might have been a distant, heart-sized thump. She followed not a map but a sensation, a familiarity that made her breath catch, the same metallic, mineral smell she had first noticed under the prince's bed. It led her to a low, wider chamber. The ceiling here was higher, though still uneven. The floor, unlike the corridor's roughness, had been smoothed deliberately. In the center of the chamber lay a shallow depression, round and wide, as if something heavy and circular had rested there for a long time. Around it, symbols had been carved into the stone, lines, arcs, shapes that had never been any alphabet she was taught, yet hummed with a meaning older than written words. Wax had pooled in their grooves many times, hardened, been melted again. The rim of the central hollow was stained with something dark that had sunk too deep into the stone to be cleaned away. When she stood at the edge of that central depression, the hair on the back of her neck rose. Cold exhaled from it, upward, into her face. If she closed her eyes, she could imagine a shaft above her, not of rock, but of absence, leading directly to the space under the prince's bed. She had seen enough rituals performed in humble houses to recognize the skeleton of one here, raised to a scale those houses could never imagine. This chamber was not an accident. Neither was the bed above it. She did not know which frightened her more, the thought that the vampire king was unaware of this, or the possibility that he had ordered it built. Back in the boy's room, the knowledge sat under her skin like a prickle, making stillness harder. The next time she watched the darkness under the bed pulse with its slow, gluttonous rhythm, she imagined it reaching down through that shaft, into the hollow, into the deeper bones of the castle. She imagined the energy it drew not simply dissolving, but traveling, feeding something else. She thought of the castle's perpetual half-night, the unchanging strength of its walls, the way storms seemed to break around it instead of on it. Power held in place had to come from somewhere. The boy's small body, she realized, had been designated as one such somewhere. She began to test the boundaries of what she could change without anyone noticing immediately. At first, the experiments were small. One evening, under the guise of cleaning, she shifted the bed very slightly. Not enough that a casual glance would notice, but enough that the posts no longer aligned perfectly with the patterned tiles beneath. That night, the cold under the bed moved lazily to reclaim its customary area. The pulsing shadow seemed to take longer to find its full strength. The boy slept with slightly fewer interruptions. In the morning, however, 2 footmen appeared with an air of having been sent. Under a murmured pretext about dust and drafts, they adjusted the bed's position, nudging it back into its exact former alignment using markers in the floor that had looked merely decorative to her before. She apologized and watched their hands. They never looked under the bed. They did not need to. They moved the heavy frame as one moves an altar, carefully, with small corrections, with unconscious reverence. Another day, she palmed a pinch of coarse salt from the kitchen and wrapped it in a cloth in her apron pocket. At the next opportunity, she sprinkled a thin line along the edge of the rug on one side of the bed, under the valance, where fingers groping to tuck in the covers would not disturb it. It was an old superstition, this idea that certain lines could block certain forces. In most households she had visited, such measures were charms against restless spirits, not against whatever lived here. Still, she tried. In the deepest part of the night, when the underbed darkness swelled, she heard a faint crackle from that salted edge. The cold shifted sideways, like water encountering a rock. For several breaths the boy's chest rose easier. Then the pulsing shadow redistributed itself, threads stretching around the obstacle. The relief was brief, but it was proof of something. The thing had limits. It reacted. It could be hindered. Such hindrances, however, could never be more than minor irritants if she moved alone. The creature, or mechanism, or spell, knit itself into the castle's very structure. To free the prince entirely would require confronting not just that coiled absence, but whoever had deemed its presence necessary. The king did not summon her. It was not the custom here for the ruler to concern himself with the day-to-day ministrations of caretakers. She glimpsed him rarely, a tall figure at the far end of a hall, surrounded by advisors, a presence at the head of a long table in the great hall when she passed a doorway and saw rows of candles and moving figures below. He carried his age without any of the frailty it visited on human bodies. His hair was the color of old bone, his skin pale but firm, his movements measured. His eyes were a deeper, steadier red than his son's, like coals banked in a hearth that never cooled. When those eyes passed over people, they seemed to assess and categorize without malice or tenderness. She saw no queen. Portraits along the gallery showed generations of rulers, some alone, some with consorts and siblings and children. In the most recent paintings, the vampire king appeared always alone, one hand resting on a sword, or a throne, or a map whose countries had been shaded darker where his borders extended. The prince's image appeared in only one painting, unfinished, a small figure sketched lightly in the margin near the king, no color yet, the outline of his face blurred. From servants' murmurs and scraps of talk, she pieced together more. The king's reign had been long and remarkably stable. Crops in the valley below rarely failed. Invading armies who had tested his borders had been turned away, sometimes without a single battle, as if some misfortune or sudden reconsideration had struck them. Plagues that rolled through neighboring lands stumbled at the river below the castle and did not cross. Storms broke around this cliff, their worst fury deflected. People muttered about sorcery and protection with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Protection always had a cost. She had seen this in smaller ways in smaller places, families that stayed healthy while another family's children died, fields that thrived unexpectedly while neighboring plots withered. Humans, given the chance, shifted their losses onto others. Why should a king be different? If she went to him directly and laid out what she had seen, what argument could she make that he had not already weighed? One sickly son for a secure kingdom. One life, quietly dwindling, for the continued strength of walls and crops and subjects. An heir, true, but even heirs were replaceable in theory. The king had centuries in which to beget another, while his people had only one harvest at a time. She watched the boy's chest rise and fall. She watched bruises appear in the hollows of his elbows and behind his knees, places where nothing physical had pressed him. She watched his gaze follow the shuttered windows with mute longing when she cracked them open. A fraction at noon to let in a sliver of gray light and fresh air. He seemed then like a moth trapped behind glass, battering itself silently against transparent boundaries. He had not chosen any of this. That simple fact weighed heavier with her than calculations of balance and cost. On a night when rain lashed the shutters so hard it sounded like a storm of thrown stones, she made her choice. She did not announce it aloud. She did not pray or swear. She simply waited for the hour when the pulsing under the bed reached its fullest, when the darkness there felt almost swollen, and then she did what instinct and training told her never to do, she reached under. Before her fingers crossed the threshold, she prepared herself for sensations, cold that bit to the bone, a pull like a river's current, the slick feel of something fleshy and wrong. What she felt instead, at first, was nothing at all. Her hand slid along the floorboards, under the valance, into the deeply shadowed space. The air there was colder, yes, but more than that, it felt thin, as if there was less of it. She extended her arm further, stretching fingers, until her shoulder pressed against the bed's frame and the join of planks and wall. Her fingertips grazed something that was not wood and not stone. It was like touching the surface of water that had been stilled and frozen, without any of ice's hardness. Resistance, then yielding, then an inward give that threatened to draw her in. Where her skin met it, sensation blurred. Numbness raced up her fingers to her palm, as if feeling itself were being swallowed. She jerked her hand back reflexively. Cold clung to her skin for a moment, then retreated, leaving her fingers tingling as though pins pricked them. The boy murmured in his sleep, a pained sound, and his breath hitched. Under the bed, something shifted more violently than usual, like a great animal twitching in its dream. There it was again, that impression of a struggle between forces. The more she interfered, even clumsily, the more it reacted. She could not tear it out by force. But she could, perhaps, change the conditions it depended on. The next day, when servants brought fresh linens, she insisted on changing the bed herself. They looked relieved to hand over the task. As she stripped the sheets and blankets, she studied the mattress and frame. The wood bore faint scorings, carved deeply and then smoothed, arranged in patterns that matched some of the sigils she had seen in the chamber below. Iron nails held the frame together where other beds used wood pegs. Each nail's head had been carefully scratched with tiny marks. She realized then that it was not simply the creature that made the conduit. The bed itself was part of the system. To defeat what lay under, she would have to undo what it lay inside. Her mind measured risks. If she destroyed the bed, openly, someone would notice long before she could learn anything useful. If she tried to build a new one, the king's agents would surely intervene. Any obvious act of rebellion would end not just the experiment but her ability to help the boy at all. So she chose a slower sabotage. At the edge of a seam where two planks joined, she inserted a sliver of wood slightly thicker than it should be. At a nail head, she scraped away a fraction of the carved sigil, disrupting one of its lines. Between mattress and frame she slid a folded square of cloth on which she had drawn, in the faintest of lines with a mixture of ash and salt water, a simple symbol she had learned in childhood from an old woman who had overseen births and deaths, a loop with a bar through it, meant to interrupt certain flows. Every change was tiny. Alone, each might do nothing. Together, over nights and weeks, they began to disturb the script of the ritual she had not been invited to read. At first, the effects were subtle. The pulsing under the bed faltered occasionally, its rhythm breaking and resuming with a stutter. On some nights, the boy's fevers rose higher than before, but then broke suddenly, leaving him sweating and exhausted yet strangely clear-eyed in the morning. He began to speak in fragments, not full sentences, but more than the occasional hoarse word he had managed earlier. He asked, once, without looking at her, whether there had always been a humming sound in the walls. She answered him obliquely, keeping her tone neutral. She did not want the castle to notice. But the castle noticed. Or someone within it did. Once, coming back from the kitchens with a small bowl of broth she preferred to prepare herself rather than trust to disinterested hands, she found a man standing just inside the prince's chamber. He wore the dark, precise clothing of an advisor, not the practical garb of a servant. His hair was perfectly arranged. His hands were bare, his fingers long. He stood beside the bed as if listening, not to the boy, who slept, but to the air itself. When she entered, he turned. His eyes were neither red nor entirely human. Their color lived somewhere between amber and rust, bright and cold. He greeted her as the boy's caretaker, the new one, the one who had lasted longer than the last. He remarked, not as a question, but as a fact, that the prince's condition had changed slightly in recent nights. She inclined her head and gave him the kind of answer that said something and nothing in equal measure, that illness often altered its pattern, sometimes for reasons no healer could guess. She assured him that she recorded everything faithfully. She did not mention underbed shadows or carved sigils. He watched her for a long moment, as if weighing not her words but the spaces around them. Then he glanced once at the bed, at the floor, at the shutters, each in turn, as though checking points on a chart only he could see. He left without another word, but after that she felt a prickle at the base of her skull more often, as if someone who did not stand in the room nonetheless knew where she moved. The king remained distant. Yet once, late, when she walked along an upper gallery that overlooked the great hall, she saw him standing alone by one of the tall, narrow windows. No court surrounded him. No servants hovered. He looked out toward the invisible valley beyond the cliff, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. For a moment, in the faint reflection on the glass, she imagined she saw the boy's likeness standing beside him, smaller, thinner, the same profile softened. The vision was only her mind placing what should have been there. In reality, the king's reflection had no such companion. He turned his head slightly and seemed to focus on some point far below, perhaps a fire in the village, perhaps nothing. The castle below him lay quiet and obedient, its people sheltered from the storm that battered at the shutters above. In that posture, she read a kind of ownership that did not distinguish between stone and flesh, between walls and sun. All were components in the same long equation he had been solving for centuries. She withdrew before he could sense her gaze. She returned to the boy's room with her resolve hardened in a way that surprised even her. On the night when everything shifted, the sky had cleared at last. For the first time since her arrival, actual moonlight crept around the edges of the shutters, a faint pale line. The castle's stones seemed to hold still, listening. She had prepared as well as she could. The underbed creature had been weakened by weeks of sabotage, but not dismantled. The boy had experienced nights of relative ease and nights of sharper struggle. The household had grown slightly accustomed to the idea that his condition was in flux. The advisory man with the amber eyes had not returned, or if he had done so when she was absent. She waited until the bells marked midnight. The air thickened. The familiar cold rose from the floor. The prince's breath shortened. This time, instead of merely observing, she drew back the valance and, in one motion, slid herself under the bed up to her shoulders. The darkness enveloped her. For a moment, panic clawed up her throat as if she had plunged underwater. The air felt thin and old. Her lamp, left above, threw only a narrow wash of light around the edges. Before her stretched that impossible shaft, widening downward, its sides made of nothing she could name. Coiled along its inner curve, slack but huge, lay the shadow limb, thicker now than she had ever seen it, swollen with accumulated taking. Threads extended from it, innumerable, delicate, converging on a point directly above her chest, the underside of the mattress, where the boy lay. For a heartbeat, she froze, as any creature might when presented suddenly with something it had only glimpsed. The scale of the thing was wrong for any human mind. It was like looking into a throat that ran down to the center of the world. She did not allow herself a second heartbeat of paralysis. Her hands moved, flicking the small knife she carried from its sheath at her wrist. It was an ordinary blade, human-made, steel-honed for cutting meat and cloth. Against whatever this was, it might as well have been a twig. Yet she had nothing else. She slashed at the nearest of the threads. The knife met resistance not of matter but of intent. It was like pushing metal through syrup that did not want to part. The thread dimmed briefly where the blade passed, then reformed. The limb pulsed, as though irritated by an insect sting. The boy stifled a whimper above, his body tensing. Fine. If she could not cut it, she could disrupt it. She shifted tactics, jabbing rather than slicing, waving the blade through as many threads as she could reach in quick, erratic motions. The space under the bed thickened, resisting her. Cold closed around her wrists like manacles. The shadow limb convulsed, once, twice. Above, the mattress shook slightly. The boy's breath caught, then surged. The pulsing under her shifted from its greedy rhythm to something more erratic, spiking and dropping without pattern. The shaft of darkness deepened in color, if such a thing was possible, and for the first time she heard a sound not her own in that space, a low, resonant vibration somewhere between a growl and a distant avalanche. It did not come through her ears so much as through her bones. The castle responded. She felt it in the walls, a tremor, subtle but definite. Far off, doors slammed of their own accord. The fire in the room above roared higher, then guttered. The bells, which never faltered, skipped a beat in their usual measured striking. Somewhere, deep in the castle's oldest stone, something complained, a long, grinding moan. Her hands went numb up to the elbows. The knife slipped from her fingers and vanished into the dark. Threads she had disturbed withdrew briefly, then flung themselves back, wrapping around her forearms, seeking skin. The sensation was pressure without touch, as if expectation alone gripped her. She realized, in that moment, that the thing under the bed had more than one appetite. If she remained, it would take what it could from her as well, and the castle would hardly protest the replacement. One human caretaker for one day's lesson drain on the prince was not a bargain she wished to strike. She wriggled backward with all the force she could muster, using the friction of her shoulders against the floor and bed frame to drag herself out. Shadow clung to her like cobwebs, reluctant to let her go. The last sensation as her head cleared the valance was a scraping along her spine, as though claws of cold had dragged there. She emerged half-sprawled on the rug, lungs burning. Above, the boy lay rigid, eyes open but unfocused, mouth parted as he gulped air he seemed not to feel. His hands clawed weakly at the sheets. On his neck and arms, veins stood out dark, then gradually subsided to their usual bruised faintness. The castle's moan faded. The bells resumed. The fire found its level. Under the bed, the pulsing slowed into an irregular throb, wounded but not undone. Her arms bore no marks, yet they ached deep inside, as though the bone itself had been chilled. She forced herself to move, to sit, to take the prince's face in her cold numb hands and speak his name in a low, steady tone that the castle might hear, but could not easily twist. She told him, without words of comfort or promises she could not guarantee, that he was still here, that she was still here, that the space between bed and floor held something that had been thwarted tonight. In the days that followed, the castle did not strike at her openly. No guards came to drag her away. No advisor with amber eyes accused her. The king did not summon her to answer for tremors in his stone. That silence frightened her more than any confrontation would have. Yet the boy changed. He remained frail. He remained often tired, often feverish, often caught in dreams that left him shaking. But slowly, a line in his face eased. He woke more often with his gaze clear. He could sit longer without nearly fainting. His appetite, meager and strange as befitted his mixed blood, became slightly less reluctant. The bruises still appeared in odd places, but less frequently, as though the invisible hands that gripped him had grown lazy, or cautious. Under the bed, the shadow limb never regained its former thickness. It persisted, entrenched, but its pulsing was less triumphant. It recoiled more quickly from salt lines and small, careful disruptions she continued to create in the bedframe's sigils. The connection to the chamber below remained, but its flow was weaker. She had not broken the bargain that ran through this castle like a hidden vein. She had frayed one of its threads. Perhaps, she thought, that would have to be enough. Perhaps some spells could not be undone without bringing down everything they held up, walls and people alike. Perhaps the best she could give the boy was more time and a measure of reclaimed self, not a miraculous freedom from all harm. Yet each night, as she sat beside his bed and felt the muted, struggling pulse beneath, she did not stop imagining other possibilities. The human mind, faced with cruelty arranged as necessity, invented alternate worlds as naturally as breathing. The boy grew used to her presence. He would open his eyes and find her there and relax, just a little, in the knowledge that someone in this stone labyrinth had chosen him over the castle. As his strength allowed, he began to ask for stories, not in spoken words, which came hard, but with the direction of his gaze, with the faintest outline of a smile when she described distant markets, river summers, houses where sickness had not eaten the furniture's very shadows. She did not tell him what she saw under his bed. Some truths a child should not be asked to carry, especially one whose body had already been made into a channel for other people's fears. Instead, she bore that knowledge and its weight herself, as she had borne other children's fevers and parents' grief. It settled into her like another bone. Everyone outside blamed a curse on the prince. Servants whispered that the boy's blood was wrong or that some ancestor's oath had come due. They spoke of inevitability and fate because those words allowed them to live beside horror without feeling compelled to touch it. She knew now that it was neither simple fate nor simple curse. It was an arrangement, between a king and his stone, between a castle and the land beneath it, between safety for many and suffering for one. She also knew that arrangements, however old, could be altered by the persistent refusal of a single, stubborn person to accept them entirely as given. Beneath the bed, under the mattress where the prince rested, the truth still coiled, wounded, wary, waiting. It had not been banished. But it no longer fed unchecked. Between its unseen mouth and the boy's heart, the nanny had jammed the equivalent of a stick in a gear, a hand in a closing door. It was not the ending a tale deserved, perhaps. It was not clean, or final, or triumphant. It was an interruption. Sometimes, in lives shaped by forces as huge and formless as darkness under a bed, an interruption was the bravest and most dangerous act anyone could manage.